It is one of the most haunting crimes in American history. The daring kidnapping and tragic death of Charles Lindbergh Jr.
On the first day of March 1932, Charles Lindbergh, a global celebrity, discovered his 20-month-old son was missing from his crib. Everyone was talking about this shocking event. People are still quite curious about this murder mystery, even though it was solved 90 years ago. Many have referred to it as the crime of the century. Listen closely as we describe the beginning of that terrifying night. It was late in the night when Betty Gow, the baby's nurse, went to secure the room's windows with shutters. It was a brand new, pricey Lindbergh house. However, despite Betty's and the baby's mother's best efforts, one of the shutters was damaged and would not lock correctly. As soon as Betty heard the baby boy's deep breaths, she placed him in his cot and waited for him to fall asleep. Around 10 o'clock at night, Betty returned to see how the baby was doing. Instead of turning on the lights, she crept silently into his room, taking care not to wake him. However, she realized something was seriously wrong the moment she approached the crib. As far as she could tell, the tiny kid was not breathing. It turned out that the crib was empty when she peeked inside it. The baby was gone. Just down the hall, Anne was taking a bath when Betty hurried over to inform her. The baby wasn't with Anne either. Following this, Betty had the impression that perhaps Charles Lindbergh, the child's father, was attempting to pull a prank by hiding the child in some location. He was known to tease the staff in that way. So Betty ran downstairs to Lindbergh's study and blurted out, "Do you have the baby?" Lindbergh looked confused and said the baby should be in his crib. They were all shocked to see the empty crib when they went back to the nursery. Lindbergh told his wife, "They've stolen our baby." It was March 1st, 1932, and the kidnapping of their son Charlie would set off an enormous crisis that made headlines across America. Even now, over a century after it all happened, the investigation and trial that followed are highly controversial. Nowadays, it's hard to imagine how well known and beloved Charles Lindbergh was in 1932. 5 years prior, he made history as the first lone pilot to cross the Atlantic Ocean in his little plane, the Spirit of St. Louis. This made him a true celebrity and a national hero. Given that the Wright brothers had accomplished the first powered aircraft flight only 24 years prior, Charles Lindbergh's transatlantic journey was an incredible feat. The first flight in 1903 barely went 120 feet and lasted 12 seconds. However, Lindbergh flew 3,500 miles of ocean solo for 33.5 hours without a co-pilot. The world realized this was not just a small stunt. It proved airplanes could change everything. Around 150,000 people greeted Lindbergh at the Paris airstrip following his momentous flight. He received 2 million telegrams and letters congratulating him. He became a national hero upon his return to the United States and got filthy rich overnight. Raymond Orteg, a hotel owner, offered $25,000, about $375,000 in today's money, to the pilot who could fly non-stop from New York to Paris in 1919. Just 3 months later, he published an autobiography called We that became the best-selling book. His enormous fame continued after he married writer Anne Morrow in 1929. Their first son, Charles Jr., was born in 1930 on Anne's 24th birthday. Charles Lindbergh was nicknamed Lucky Lindy and the Lone Eagle after his famous flight. Since the Lindberghs were already famous, photographers were in a frenzy to capture every minute of the baby's life and publish them in newspapers around the country. Though the Lindbergh family was wealthy, the country was still in the depths of the Great Depression in 1932. Some people resented the family's privilege and lavish lifestyle. Tragically, someone decided to take their envy to a criminal extreme. On the night of March 1st, the Lindbergh family was staying at their new home in Hopewell, New Jersey, which was still under construction. Normally, they would have been at their other estate during the weekdays, but Charlie Jr. had a cold, so they remained in Hopewell that Monday night. Somehow, the kidnapper seemed to know about this change in the family's usual routine. After the nurse discovered Charlie missing, Lindbergh quickly called the police while grabbing a rifle to search for the culprit. When Lindbergh went outside after discovering Charlie missing, he found a ransom note demanding $50,000 for the baby's return. It wanted him not to involve the police, but he had already colored them by then. News of the shocking kidnapping spread rapidly across the nation. A cruel criminal had cruelly kidnapped the famous pilot's 20-month-old son son, little Lindy, and held him for ransom. Search parties scoured the isolated 390-acre Lindbergh estate. Police found an improvised ladder, discarded about 75 feet from the home. It was just tall enough to reach the nursery window from which the kidnapper had snatched the baby. Grooves in the soft earth showed where the ladder had been propped up against the house. One of the rungs was broken, which may have been the loud thump Lindbergh had heard but dismissed while working in his study that night. Footprints led away from the area where the ladder was found. The police tried to cast the footprints found near the discarded ladder, but the kidnapper had taken steps to obscure them, likely wearing socks over their shoes or wrapping their feet. This prevented getting clear prints, though investigators could estimate the general foot size. The prints led away from the house towards the road, where the trail went cold, suggesting the kidnapper had an accomplice waiting in a getaway vehicle. The poorly written ransom note made it clear this was a kidnapping for money. Someone had maliciously taken the famous couple's infant son as a bargaining chip. Charles Lindbergh vowed to cooperate fully and pay any ransom to ensure his son's safe return. This heinous crime against such a well-known family captivated the nation. The case drew frantic attention from well-meaning civilians who wanted to help, as well as opportunistic criminals looking to somehow profit from the tragedy. Even the notorious gangster Al Capone issued a reward of $10,000 for information leading to the kidnapper's capture and the baby's return, condemning it as the most outrageous thing I ever heard of. However, Capone was already in jail awaiting appeals for tax evasion, so his offer seemed self-serving. This led some, like Lindbergh's attorney, to theorize that the kidnappers were from the criminal underworld. They brought in a known bootlegger named Morris Rosner to assist, believing his underworld connections could facilitate negotiations with the kidnappers. Lindbergh agreed and allowed Rosner to work from home to have full access to case details. Rosner then introduced two shadowy figures from New York's underground, Salvatore Spitale and Irving Bitts. Lindbergh publicly authorized them as go-betweens with the kidnappers. The idea was that the criminals might deal more openly with fellow mobsters than the police. However, Spitale and Bitts quickly turned the situation into a publicity stunt, setting up betting pools and speakeasies exploiting the case. They theorized that someone close to the family must have inadvertently given away details like the unlocked nursery window to aid the kidnapping plot. The intense police interrogations made some Lindbergh staff members extremely uncomfortable, with one woman attempting suicide to avoid further questioning. Meanwhile, underworld figures like Morris Rosner claimed to be making progress, with Rosner announcing on March 12th that he had assurances the baby was alive and well and would soon be returned if the family's dietary instructions were followed. This provided some hope for the anguished parents. More ransom notes continued to arrive, one increasing the demand to $70,000 and complaining that police involvement would cause delays in the child's return, based on mistakes like using the German word gut for good. Handwriting experts concluded that everyone who wrote the notes had a German education. While the criminal go-betweens flailed unproductively, an anonymous letter writer insisted he could help negotiate with the kidnappers directly. An elderly retired schoolteacher named John F. Condon saw an opportunity to insert himself into the high-profile case. After his letter offering to help was published, Condon received a response from the kidnapper, accepting him as a go-between. The Lindberghs initially dismissed Condon until he mentioned the distinct ransom note symbol, at which point they brought him in using the code name Jafsy. Weeks after the kidnapping, the Lindberghs gathered the $70,000 ransom using the denominations specified, mostly difficult to trace small bills, some larger notes, and even gold certificates. Jafsy soon let a man dubbed Cemetery John, who spoke with a European accent, to prove he actually had the baby. Cemetery John promised to send the pajamas little Lindy was wearing the night he was taken. A few days later, the distinct blue Dr. Denton sleep suit arrived, providing hope that the baby was alive. The kidnapper instructed that once the full ransom was paid, he would reveal the child's location within 8 hours. Jafsy Condon placed a newspaper ad saying the money was ready. Soon after, a taxi driver arrived with instructions for the ransom drop that night at a cemetery. Lindbergh stuffed the cash into a wooden box as specified, but Jafsy secretly held back $20,000, confident the full amount wasn't needed. At the cemetery drop site, Jaffe encountered the accented voice of Cemetery John. After some procedural delays in getting a written receipt, Jaffe handed over the box with $50,000. Cemetery John accepted the lower amount without issue. He then gave Jaffe a sealed envelope, warning it contained the child's location but should not be opened for 8 more hours. Against instructions, Jaffe and Lindbergh immediately opened the envelope after the ransom drop. It claimed the baby was being held on a boat called Nelly Boat near Cape Cod, misspelled like the other notes. Lindbergh and his search teams scoured the area for days, meticulously checking any boats they encountered, but there was no sign of little Charlie or the kidnappers. Jaffe placed another newspaper ad pleading for better information, but no further contact came. The ransom had been paid, but the child was not returned as promised. Over a month later, on May 12th, a truck driver discovered the decomposed remains of an infant near the Lindbergh estate. Charles Lindbergh was brought to identify the body, confirming the terrible truth. It was his missing son, Charlie. An autopsy determined the 20-month-old had suffered a fatal skull fracture, likely on the night he was taken. The broken ladder rung may have caused the deadly injury if the kidnapper mishandled the child's weight. Regardless of intent, the famous baby was already dead soon after being abducted. After little Charlie's body was discovered, remnants of the ransom money began surfacing around New York City, mostly in small, difficult-to-trace bills. Over 2 years later, the taxi driver who had delivered a ransom letter to Jaffe spotted the man who had paid him that night. He reported the license plate to the FBI, leading them to a suspect, Bruno Richard Hauptmann. With this promising lead after years of false starts, authorities closely monitored Hauptmann. They discovered he had inexplicably been spending money from various sources after previously being in poor financial straits. The spending matched the time period when the ransom money was re-entering circulation in New York. Agents also learned Hauptmann had purchased lumber and tools just before the kidnapping that could have been used to build the ransom ladder. Finally, they found one of his bedroom floors had been improperly refinished recently using plain tools, possibly to conceal floorboard removal and create a hiding spot. Despite being unemployed for over a year, Hauptmann had expensive new furnishings in his home that raised suspicions. A search of Hauptmann's residence uncovered thousands in cash from the ransom payments, hidden in garage beams, cans buried in the yard, and even written clues linking him to the go-between Jaffe Condon. His flimsy excuse about the money allegedly belonging to a deceased friend named Isidore Fish did not convince investigators. The circumstantial evidence was damning, from the ransom money itself, to his recent carpentry work beforehand, to potential witnesses identifying him. Prosecutors charged Bruno Richard Hauptmann with the kidnapping and murder of Charles Lindbergh Jr. At his sensational 1935 trial, Hauptmann faced testimony identifying the body as the Lindbergh's son, the child's belongings from the crime, and Charles Lindbergh himself claiming to recognize Hauptmann's voice from the ransom drop. Though Hauptmann maintained his innocence, the mountain of evidence overwhelmed the defense. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. Despite appeals, the conviction for the crime of the century stood. On April 3, 1936, Bruno Richard Hauptmann was executed by electric chair for the murder of the Lindbergh baby. Though he maintained his innocence, the weight of the evidence seemed convincing at the time. However, years later, a journalist named Anthony Scaduto published a book arguing Hauptmann was actually innocent. Hauptmann's widow also insisted her husband was framed, recounting people screaming "Kill the German" at his trial. Reviewing the coverage shows many reporters taking Hauptmann's guilt as a foregone conclusion based on his nationality and circumstantial evidence alone. Some even theorized outlandish conspiracies for which Lindbergh himself was responsible, or that the baby never died at all. Over the decades, over a dozen individuals have falsely claimed to be the living Lindbergh baby. In the aftermath, the devastated Lindbergh family left America behind, moving to England and eventually having 5 more children together. Later in his life, when he was facing additional controversy, Charles Lindbergh reportedly had a number of other children out of wedlock. The kidnapping and death of their first son remains one of the most infamous crimes in US history, precisely because it struck at the heart of America's celebrated heroes. If you enjoyed this exploration into the haunting Lindbergh case, be sure to like, share, and comment on the video.